September 18, 1944, 7:30 hours. The southern peninsula of Peleliu was already alive with noise. I note the heat first, because every account written by men who fought there begins with it. The sun had been up barely an hour, yet the temperature was climbing toward extremes that stripped the body of strength without warning. The air lay heavy over the coral, unmoving, thick with cordite, pulverized stone, and the smell of decaying vegetation burned black by artillery fire. The island did not feel like land. It felt like an exposed bone. From a shallow depression near the base of a coral ridge, a 19-year-old Marine pressed himself flat against the ground and waited. His name was Arthur Jackson. At that moment, he had been on Peleliu for 3 days. He had not yet fired a shot that could be called a confirmed kill. To his left, Marines were being cut down by machine gun fire that arrived without warning and without mercy. To his right, the ground rose sharply into jagged coral formations that offered no cover, only shadows that shifted with the sun. Ahead of him lay open ground, roughly 150 yards of exposed coral rubble ending in a reinforced Japanese pillbox built directly into the ridge. It was one of many. Together, they formed a shallow arc across the southern end of the island, interlocking fields of fire designed not to repel an enemy, but to absorb one, bleed it, and destroy it. In place by the standards of earlier Pacific battles, the Americans should already have been moving inland. Peleliu had been forecast as a short operation, 4 days, perhaps 5. That assumption had already proven catastrophically wrong. On the first day alone, more than 1,000 Marines had fallen on the beaches and inland approaches. The Japanese had not met them at the waterline in massed charges. They had not rushed machine guns with bayonets fixed. They had waited. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commanding the Japanese garrison, had abandoned doctrine that no longer served its purpose. His force, numbering in the thousands, had turned the island itself into a weapon. Concrete bunkers were buried into coral ridges. Natural caves were expanded and reinforced. Tunnels connected positions across distances, measured not in meters, but in hundreds of yards. Each defensive point supported the next. Each was designed to remain invisible until it fired. What the Marines faced that morning was not a line to be broken, and systems do not collapse. Easily by 7:30. One Marine regiment had already suffered losses, approaching 70%. Units no longer advanced by maneuver, they moved by attrition. The 7th Marines, Jackson's regiment, had been ordered into the southern sector with a task that appeared simple on paper and lethal in practice: clear the fortified positions blocking the advance toward the airfield. The problem lay in the construction. Japanese engineers had used the island's coral not as an obstacle, but as a foundation. Pillboxes were poured into ridgelines with walls several feet thick. Their firing slits were narrow, deliberately angled, and protected from direct assault. A machine gun placed inside such a position could dominate open ground with little risk to the crew. Grenades bounced, rifle fire sparked, and ricocheted. Men who attempted to rush the apertures were killed before they reached them. Each attempt ended the same way, with bodies lying motionless in front of concrete that showed no damage at all. Jackson's platoon had advanced less than 200 yards since dawn. A single pillbox controlled the approach. Every movement drew fire. They could not move forward. They could not pull back. 3 Marines had already been killed trying to find a route around it. Ordinarily, tanks or artillery would be brought forward. On Peleliu, neither option existed. The coral ridges were too steep for armor, the approach lanes too narrow. Artillery could not be employed without destroying the Marines. Pinned down in front of the target, someone had to cross the open ground. I pause here because this is where myth often intrudes. Later, retellings describe courage in abstract terms. They omit the mathematics. On open terrain under fire, a man moves perhaps 15 yards per second if he is not already wounded. 150 yards meant roughly 10 seconds of exposure. The Japanese Type 92 machine gun, firing conservatively, could send dozens of rounds into that space in the same interval. There were at least 2 guns in the bunker. The odds were not poor. They were terminal. Everyone present understood this. The officers understood it. The non-commissioned officers understood it. Jackson understood it. He also understood something else. Every minute his platoon remained pinned, more men would die. Not later, not eventually, immediately. Waiting for a solution that might never arrive was simply a slower form of exposure. Jackson loaded a fresh magazine into his Browning automatic rifle. He filled his pockets with grenades until there was no room left. Then he stood up. He did not ask permission. He did not signal. He did not wait for covering fire to be arranged. He simply rose from the quarrel and began to run. The bar was not designed for what followed. Weighing close to 20 pounds when loaded, it was meant to be fired from the prone or supported position. Jackson carried it at hip height, muzzle sweeping, trigger depressed. Accuracy was irrelevant. Suppression was everything. The Japanese gunners saw him immediately. Their weapons swung toward the moving figure crossing open ground alone. Bullets cracked past his head. Coral fragments exploded at his feet. The sound was continuous, mechanical, without variation. Jackson fired as he ran. His rounds struck concrete and stone, throwing sparks and dust into the firing slit. The bullets did not penetrate. They did not need to. They forced the gunners to duck. They stole seconds. At roughly halfway, his magazine ran dry. He dropped behind a coral outcrop, reloaded, and surged forward again. The firing resumed almost at once, heavier now, more concentrated. At close range, the geometry of the pillbox began to work against its defenders. The narrow firing apertures that had provided such lethal coverage also limited their angles. Jackson reached the blind area directly beside the main opening. The men inside could hear him. They could not hit him. He pulled a white phosphorus grenade and shoved it through the slit. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. White phosphorus ignites on contact with air. Inside a confined space, it produces heat and smoke that cannot be escaped. Screams followed. Japanese soldiers stumbled out of the aperture with their clothing aflame. Their ammunition began to detonate as it heated. Jackson shot them as they emerged, his bar cutting them down before they could bring weapons to bear. Phosphorus alone was not sufficient. The bunker extended deeper into the ridge. Some defenders had withdrawn to secondary chambers. Others resumed fire from alternate openings. Jackson took a package of plastic explosive 40 pounds, fused for a short to land, forced it through the main slit. He ran. He dove into a shell crater and pressed himself flat as the explosion lifted the bunker from its foundation. Concrete, timber, and bodies were thrown into the air. The blast wave struck the ground hard enough to leave him momentarily stunned. When the dust settled, the pillbox no longer existed. Jackson stood, ears ringing, hands shaking. He was alive. 35 Japanese soldiers were not. Ahead of him, more bunkers continued to fire into the Marine lines. A rational decision would have been to return, report success, and allow the next assault to be organized. Jackson did not return. He reloaded, checked what grenades remained, and began moving toward the next position. The second pillbox lay to the northwest, smaller, holding perhaps 5 defenders. The explosion had alerted the remaining positions. Surprise was gone. Jackson adjusted. He moved through folds in the coral, using jagged ridges to mask his approach. He crawled the last distance, dragging the bar behind him. Grenades were thrown blindly from inside the bunker, detonating against stone. Jackson climbed onto the roof. He found a narrow ventilation shaft, too small for a grenade. He placed the muzzle of his weapon into the opening and fired. The rounds ricocheted inside the concrete chamber. He reloaded and fired again. When he descended, the bunker was silent. By now, the pattern was clear. Jackson was not improvising wildly. He was learning, adapting, exploiting weaknesses created by design. The third and fourth pillboxes were positioned to protect one another. Each covered the approaches to its neighbor. Jackson observed the firing arcs, identified a narrow corridor between them that neither could fully engage, and sprinted through it. He reached the first bunker before the gunners could shift. He fired directly into the aperture until the magazine emptied. Threw his last fragmentation grenade and moved on. For bunkers fell in quick succession. The time elapsed was measured in minutes. Jackson's ammunition was running low. His weapon overheated. He had no explosives left. Still, he continued. At the fifth bunker, the design changed. A rear tunnel entrance, concealed by coral and vegetation, allowed defenders to move between positions. Jackson did not know it was there until a Japanese soldier emerged behind him with a bayonet fixed. Jackson turned and fired instinctively, the man falling backward into the tunnel. More followed. Jackson dropped to one knee and fired down the passage, the confined space magnifying the effect of each shot. When the firing stopped, the bunker was quiet. 5 positions destroyed. By this point, the Japanese command understood what was happening. Reports moved through the tunnel network. Orders were issued. Reinforcements were dispatched. Jackson remained unaware. He scavenged grenades from fallen defenders. He stripped ammunition where he could. He moved on. At the 6th bunker, he could not approach unseen. It sat on elevated ground with clear sight. A small Marine rifle squad appeared on his flank, exploiting the breach he had created. Together, they assaulted the defenders, focused on the larger group. Jackson reached the roof and fired through the ventilation shaft with his final magazine. The bunker fell. The cost was visible. Marines lay wounded nearby. One was dead. Jackson had no ammunition left. He had been fighting for less than half an hour. A counterattack followed. 40 Japanese soldiers advanced through the ridges. Disciplined, silent, Jackson scavenged grenades and ammunition from the dead. He reloaded by hand, round by round. When the attack came, he and a handful of Marines met it with controlled fire. The engagement ended only when additional Marine units arrived, encircling the attackers and destroying them. The southern perimeter collapsed. What followed was methodical. With ammunition and support now available, Jackson led assaults against the remaining positions. He was wounded during the fighting, a round grazing his leg, but he continued. One bunker after another fell. Grenades, satchel charges, flamethrower bursts at close range by 9:33. The last pillbox was silent. In roughly 90 minutes, 12 fortified positions had been destroyed. Dozens of Japanese soldiers lay dead. The Marine advance resumed. Jackson collapsed against the coral. He was 19 years old. He would survive his wounds. In time, he would receive the Medal of Honor. The paperwork moved quickly. The facts were difficult to ignore. After the war, Jackson returned home. He lived quietly. He spoke little of Peleliu. Those who knew him later would describe him as reserved, unassuming, a man who carried himself without ceremony. The violence of that morning did not define his public life. History would record the numbers, the positions taken, the medal awarded. What it cannot fully capture is the effect of one individual acting alone inside a system designed to be unbreakable. Japanese defenders did not fear Jackson because he was extraordinary in temperament or rhetoric. They feared him because he dismantled their defenses methodically, exploiting weaknesses they believed did not exist. That is why this story endured, passed quietly among those who had been there, not as legend, as fact.